A quiet convenience store, neon lights humming against the cold glass. A retired soldier and his German shepherd stop only for coffee. Nothing more. Near the corner table, a young woman sits too still, eyes lowered, fingers tapping the plastic surface. 3 times. Pause. 3 again. He was trained to hear gunfire, but tonight he hears a whisper. The dog lifts his head first. Outside, a gray SUV idles, its engine ticking like a clock running out. No one sees the signal. No one expects a rescue in a place like this. But the soldier notices. The dog will not look away. And what follows will break your heart and prove that even the smallest act of courage can save a life. The night was brittle with cold, the kind of winter air that pressed against skin like shards of glass and made neon lights flicker sharper than usual. Ethan Cole pushed open the sliding door of the 24-hour convenience store, the muted chime announcing his arrival as a wave of heated air wrapped around him and his dog. For Ethan, the warmth was almost startling. For Shadow, his 5-year-old German shepherd, it was another space to scan, another place to secure. Ethan Cole was 38, a man carved from years of service that had bent his back slightly but never dimmed the sharpness of his eyes. He stood 6'1", broad-shouldered, with a frame that had once carried more muscle but was now leaner, hardened by endurance rather than strength. His jawline was square, shadowed with a day's growth of stubble that gave him a rugged, almost tired dignity. The lines etched into his face weren't from age alone, but from choices made, nights spent awake, and the kind of silence only veterans knew. His dark hair, once clipped into regulation neatness, now fell slightly longer, streaked with early gray near the temples. Ethan had left the service only 3 months ago, carrying with him both the relief of survival and the disorientation of a man suddenly without orders. He was known among his peers as calm, reliable, someone who measured his words carefully and lived with a steady self-control. But inside, Ethan was still learning how to belong to a world that no longer demanded his vigilance every second. Tonight, he only wanted a cup of hot coffee and some dog food for Shadow, a small errand that should have felt simple, almost comforting. Yet when he entered, the air felt too still, as if the store itself was holding its breath. Shadow walked at his side, head level, ears perked forward. The dog was sable-colored, with a saddle of black down his back and rust markings along his chest and legs. His amber eyes, bright and intelligent, carried the gravity of a companion who had seen conflict. Shadow was loyal to the point of severity, trained not only as a protector, but as a silent reader of spaces. At 5 years old, he was in his prime, muscular, fast, but balanced with the discipline of experience. Ethan often thought Shadow was more than just a dog. He was a reminder that not all bonds needed words, that vigilance shared was a weight halved. The store smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Refrigerators hummed along the back wall, their glass doors glowing with drinks in careful rows. Fluorescent lights cast a pale wash over shelves stacked with chips, candy bars, instant noodles, and everything a passing traveler might need. Behind the counter, a young woman in a loose green vest, her name tag barely pinned in place, looked up from her phone and offered a tired but polite nod. She was small, no more than 24, with dyed auburn hair pulled into a messy ponytail, freckles dotting her pale skin, and eyes that hinted at boredom more than malice. Her name tag read Maya, and Ethan caught the faint trace of bubble gum as she chewed slowly, tapping her nails against the register. She seemed ordinary, harmless, another young woman working the night shift for money she likely spent on classes or rent. Ethan acknowledged her with a small nod, then let his eyes sweep the store. And that was when he noticed her. In the corner, seated at one of the plastic tables near the microwaves and napkin dispenser, was a young woman who looked like she belonged nowhere and everywhere all at once. She was about 22, with long dark hair falling loosely over her shoulders, strands sticking to her face as though she had forgotten how to brush them aside. Her skin was pale, almost translucent under the fluorescent glow, and her lips pressed together tightly, as if they were the only dam holding back something that wanted to collapse. She wore a thin beige coat, clearly not warm enough for the weather, with sleeves frayed at the edges and buttons mismatched. Beneath, a faded blue dress clung awkwardly, torn slightly at the hem. Her sneakers were worn down, white once but now scuffed and gray. She sat rigid, hands clasped in her lap, except when one hand lifted to the tabletop. Tap, tap, tap. 3 times. A pause, then again. 3 times. The sound was soft, almost unnoticeable, blending into the hum of the refrigerators and the buzz of the lights. But to Ethan it cut through the air like artillery fire. He froze, because that rhythm was not random. It was a signal, one drilled into him during countless hours of training. Morse. 3 short taps. Pause. 3 more. SOS. A cry for help, disguised in the simplest rhythm. Shadow sensed it too. The dog lifted his head, ears turning toward the girl, amber eyes locked on her. His body stiffened, muscles coiled beneath his fur, and a low vibration, not yet a growl, but the suggestion of one, resonated in his chest. Ethan followed Shadow's gaze, and his stomach tightened. The girl did not look at him directly. Instead, her eyes stayed lowered, trembling as though she feared even glances could betray her. And beside her, Ethan noticed the reason. A man sat close, too close, dressed in a fitted gray suit that seemed out of place in a convenience store at this hour. He was in his early 40s, tall and lean, with blonde hair cut neatly along his scalp, and pale blue eyes so washed out they looked almost colorless. His features were sharp, angular, the kind of face that seemed carved from winter itself. His expression carried no warmth, only calculation. He sat with his legs crossed, one arm draped casually over the back of the chair, but the tension in his jaw and the possessive angle of his shoulders betrayed ownership. A man used to control. His hands, long-fingered and too steady, rested on a slim folder placed neatly on the table. He had the air of someone who measured people like assets, reducing lives to numbers and signatures. Ethan's instincts told him everything. The girl was not here by choice. The man was no companion. He was a captor. Ethan remembered men like him from deployments, men who wore civility like armor while hiding the rod of manipulation underneath. Ethan's breath slowed, his chest rising and falling evenly, though inside his pulse had quickened. He couldn't act rashly, not yet. He needed to understand, to watch, to gather. He had learned the hard way that stepping in too soon could cost lives. He glanced once at Maya behind the counter. She was absorbed in her phone again, earbud in one ear, oblivious. The SUV outside, he realized, was idling for them. He had seen the faint headlights flicker through the glass door. The vehicle was a waiting cage, its engine ticking like a clock running out. Ethan shifted slightly, as though browsing the rack of snacks, but his eyes never left the girl. She lifted her hand again, tapping 3 times, and Ethan knew it was deliberate. A plea no one else noticed. He exhaled slowly, pressing his heel against Shadow's lead to ground himself. Shadow's ears flattened, eyes sharp, body angled like a sentinel. The moment stretched, the neon hum filling the silence. Ethan Cole had walked into the store for nothing more than coffee and dog food. But now the soldier in him stirred awake, and he knew this was no ordinary errand. Something had begun that would not let him walk away. The fluorescent lights hummed with an almost insect-like persistence, casting their pale glow across every angle of the convenience store. The brightness revealed what the darkness outside hid, the trembling lines of Sarah's hands as she clenched the hem of her coat, the deliberate stillness of the suited man beside her, and the sharp amber focus of Shadow's eyes tracking them both. Ethan shifted slowly, pretending to browse the shelves of energy drinks, but in reality he was mapping angles, distances, and exits. He had learned to trust his instincts, and every nerve in his body told him this room was wrong. Sarah remained hunched over, as if shrinking into the plastic chair could make her vanish. Her long hair shadowed her pale face, but Ethan could see the wet sheen of her eyes even from across the aisle. He caught a glimpse of bruising along her wrist where the sleeve of her coat rode up, faint but unmistakable. She pressed her lips together tightly, a seam of fear holding back any sound. Each time her fingers twitched toward the folder the man had laid down, she pulled back, as though touching it would burn. The man in the gray suit exuded control without moving. His posture was composed, legs crossed neatly, the arm resting against the chair back like he owned the space. His jaw was angular, his lips thin and pressed into a neutral line that hinted more at discipline than calm. There was something rehearsed in his stillness. Ethan recognized it. Predators knew how to disappear into quiet, how to draw fear without raising their voice. The man's pale blue eyes flicked toward Sarah occasionally, sharp and cutting, a warning without words. The unopened bottle of water by his elbow seemed like a prop, something he had picked up only to maintain an air of casualness. Ethan's gaze shifted toward Maya behind the counter. She was scrolling her phone lazily, bubblegum popping faintly in her mouth, her body slouched forward. But every so often her eyes darted toward the pair in the corner. Maya might have been young and distracted, but she wasn't blind. There was a tension in the set of her shoulders, in the way her chewing slowed when the man's gaze swept too far. She didn't yet understand, but she sensed it. To the side, Shadow pressed closer to Ethan's leg, tail low but rigid, ears forward. The dog's body was a coiled spring, one quiet sound away from releasing. Ethan dropped his hand casually to rest against Shadow's back, a grounding gesture for them both. He needed time, a moment longer to piece together the picture. He couldn't storm into this like a battlefield. Here there were civilians, cameras, and laws that didn't bend for instinct. The convenience store door chimed suddenly as a new figure entered. The blast of cold air swept through, rattling the plastic advertisement sheets taped to the door. Ethan's head turned automatically. The man who walked in was in his early 50s, dressed in a thick brown parka, dusted with snow. He was short, stocky, with a weathered face that bore the look of someone who had spent his life working outdoors. His cheeks were ruddy, his gray hair cropped short, and his hands were calloused, the kind that told stories of manual labor. He gave a polite nod toward Maya, muttered a greeting, and went straight for the refrigerated case of beer. His name tag, stitched awkwardly on his jacket from some past job, read Roy. Ethan sized him up quickly. Ordinary, a man of routine, not a threat, but another witness in the room who could either help or complicate things if the situation broke. Ethan returned his focus to Sarah. She shifted in her chair, the faintest tremor visible in her shoulders. For a moment her eyes lifted toward the curved mirror near the ceiling, catching Ethan's reflection as he watched. Their gazes didn't meet directly, but something passed between them, a flicker of desperate recognition. She knew he saw her. She knew someone was listening. Her fingers twitched once more, hovering above the table, before she clenched them into her lap again. The man in the suit, Ethan would later learn his name was Cole Harrington, leaned forward at that moment. His movement was precise, almost delicate, but his presence loomed heavier. He tapped the folder once with a long finger, sliding it an inch closer toward Sarah. His voice was low, steady, but carried the bite of command. "Sign it." The word was plain, stripped of volume, but it carried weight. Sarah flinched as though struck. She shook her head quickly, almost imperceptibly, and whispered something Ethan couldn't catch. Harrington's jaw tightened. Ethan inhaled slowly through his nose, forcing his body into stillness. His instincts screamed to intervene, to close the space and pull Sarah out, but he had to be careful. He studied Harrington's posture, the way he angled his shoulders toward the exit, the way his eyes flicked once toward the glass door where the SUV idled outside, the way his left hand brushed the folder as though it contained his entire leverage. This wasn't random. This was structured intimidation. From the counter, Maya called out with forced brightness, "Hey, do you need help finding anything?" She was addressing Ethan, her eyes flicking between him and the corner table. The bubble gum was gone from her mouth, tucked against her cheek nervously. Ethan glanced back, forcing a small smile. "Just coffee." His tone was steady, calm. He hoped she understood the unspoken message. Stay calm. Keep watching. Shadow's ears twitched. The dog let out a faint rumble, barely audible, but Ethan felt it through his boot pressing against the floor. He crouched slightly, pretending to examine the bottom shelf, and whispered, "Not yet, buddy. Not yet." The fluorescent hum filled the silence again. Roy shuffled to the counter with his pack of beer, his movements slow, deliberate, unaware of the storm forming behind him. Maya rang him. Up quickly, her hands moving with the stiffness of someone who wanted him out fast. Roy paid with crumpled bills, muttered thanks, and left, the chime of the door fading into the cold night. Now it was only them, the soldier, the dog, the clerk, the girl, and the man in the suit. Ethan straightened and took a slow step toward the coffee machine, closer to the corner table, but not enough to raise suspicion. Harrington's pale eyes slid toward him briefly, calculating. There was something in his gaze Ethan recognized instantly, the look of a man measuring another not for camaraderie, but for threat. Harrington's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something thinner, a warning carved onto his face. Ethan returned the look with blank calm, his soldier's mask firmly in place. Sarah's breathing had quickened. She was pressing her hands so tightly together in her lap that her knuckles whitened. Ethan could almost feel the pulse of her fear across the room. He remembered nights when villagers in war zones had looked at him the same way, silent pleas for protection, eyes speaking what mouths dared not. Shadow shifted forward, paws clicking softly against the tile. The dog's body aligned with Ethan's stance, angled subtly toward Harrington. Ethan placed his cup under the coffee machine, pressed the button, and let the hot liquid stream into the paper cup. The hiss and drip of coffee became a disguise for the louder beat of his heart. Ethan lifted the cup slowly, wrapping his fingers around it. He took one sip, eyes never leaving the mirror's reflection. Sarah tapped her fingers once more. 3. Pause. 3. Her courage was unraveling, and she was gambling it all that someone would hear. And Ethan had heard. The decision rooted itself in him with the weight of inevitability. He wasn't leaving this store without her safe. Through the wide glass window, Ethan's eyes locked on the gray SUV parked under the flickering street lamp. Its headlights cast long, sharp beams across the asphalt, then dimmed, then flared again, as if the vehicle itself were breathing, waiting. The engine ticked with steady rhythm, the sound muffled but insistent, like the countdown of a clock running out of time. SUVs like this were favored for their capacity and anonymity. Ethan had seen plenty overseas carrying both soldiers and prisoners. Here, in a sleepy roadside neighborhood, it was an ominous presence. Shadow's ears flattened against his skull, his low growl rumbling from deep in his chest. The dog's hackles rose, a line of bristled fur running down his back, and Ethan felt the vibration through the leash looped loosely around his wrist. Shadow wasn't reacting to the cold night air outside. He was reacting to the menace radiating inward from that waiting machine. Ethan's mind calculated instinctively. He noted the SUV's position relative to the entrance, the shadows shifting inside its tinted windows. There was at least one figure in the driver's seat, possibly more. Whoever Harrington was working with, they weren't going to wait all night. Ethan knew this scenario. Intimidation inside, extraction outside, the victim shuffled out under the guise of normalcy. Once Sarah left with them, her chances of rescue would collapse into nothing. Maya shifted uneasily behind the counter, the bright neon glow painting her freckled face in pallid tones. She chewed her lip now instead of gum, eyes darting from the suited man in the corner to Ethan's calm but steady presence. Something inside her clicked, youthful apathy giving way to alertness. She slid her phone under the register, her fingers moving with forced nonchalance. She typed in the emergency line, whispered into the receiver while pretending to check stock on the shelves beneath her counter. "This is Maya at the Route 9 convenience store. There's a situation here, possible abduction. Send someone quick." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed through, lowering her tone until it was barely more than breath. She ended the call and wiped her hands on her vest as though to wash away her rising fear. Harrington must have sensed the shift in atmosphere. He leaned closer to Sarah, his long fingers brushing the folder again, his body angling toward her like a cage. His pale blue eyes cut sharply toward Maya, lingering just long enough to make her shoulders stiffen. He didn't say a word, but the weight of that glance was a threat in itself. He returned his gaze to Sarah, who flinched and shrank deeper into her chair. Sarah's thin frame trembled. Her dark hair slipped across her face as she bowed her head lower, trying to shield herself from attention. But Ethan could see the tension winding tighter in her body, the shallow rhythm of her breath. Her knuckles had turned white from gripping her coat. She looked fragile, breakable, and yet in her soft taps against the table there was still a thread of defiance, a signal sent despite the danger beside her. Ethan let his body relax deliberately, forcing his shoulders to ease and his movements to remain casual. He poured more coffee, stirred it with a plastic stick, and leaned against the counter as though he had all the time in the world. Inside, his thoughts were razor sharp. He had to keep Harrington from moving her toward that SUV. Time was bleeding away. The door chimed again. This time it was a man in his early 30s, tall and lanky, with a mess of sandy blonde hair sticking from under a knit beanie. He wore a reflective safety vest over a gray hoodie, the kind used by highway maintenance workers. His boots were scuffed, his jeans stained with grease. He gave Maya a small nod of familiarity, muttered something about his night shift, and shuffled toward the hot food warmer for a stale burrito. His name, stitched faintly into his vest, read Kenny. He looked exhausted, his eyes sunken, the permanent fatigue of someone balancing too many shifts and too little rest. Ethan noted him instantly. Another civilian in the room, another variable. Kenny wasn't dangerous, but he was a distraction Harrington might use. Ethan's eyes flicked to the SUV again. Its brake lights flared briefly, then dimmed, like a signal passed from outside to inside. Harrington's lips tightened. The man in the suit stood slowly, unfolding his long frame with deliberate calm. His chair scraped lightly against the tile, a sound that made Sarah flinch. Harrington adjusted his cufflinks with practiced precision, then picked up the folder, tucking it under one arm. His other hand hovered near Sarah's shoulder. "Time to go," he murmured, voice low but filled with steel. Shadow's growl grew louder, unmistakable this time. Ethan pressed his hand firmly against the dog's neck, steadying him. He stepped forward slightly, placing himself casually between Harrington's line to the door and the coffee station. Harrington's pale eyes locked on Ethan. A flicker of recognition passed between them, predator to predator, each assessing the other's resolve. Maya froze, pretending to rearrange the candy bars at the counter, but her trembling hands betrayed her nerves. Kenny tore open his burrito wrapper noisily, oblivious at first, but then caught the edge in the air, the silent electricity of threat. His gaze darted from Harrington's rigid stance to Ethan's calm but immovable presence. He didn't understand, not fully, but something told him to keep still. Sarah whispered, so soft Ethan barely caught it, "Please, don't." Her voice cracked on the last word. Harrington tightened his jaw, his hand pressing against Sarah's arm as he urged her up from the chair. She resisted faintly, her knees trembling, but his strength and authority weighed on her. Ethan set down his cup, his voice calm but firm, pitched just above the hum of the refrigerators. "She doesn't want to go." The words weren't loud, but they landed like a hammer. Harrington's pale eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "This is none of your concern," he said coldly. Outside, the SUV's headlights flared once more. The driver's silhouette shifted, restless. The countdown was ending. Shadow braced forward a half step, his body a wall of muscle and intent. Ethan straightened, his hand brushing the edge of the counter, his gaze steady. He had been trained for war zones, for chaos, for danger from unseen corners. But tonight the battlefield was a convenience store under humming lights, and the stakes were a trembling girl and the freedom she was about to lose forever. Ethan felt the moment coil, ready to snap, and he knew, without question, that he would not let her walk out into that waiting SUV. Maya adjusted her vest as if smoothing wrinkles could calm her nerves. Behind the counter, the hum of the register felt louder than usual, almost echoing in her chest. Her auburn ponytail slipped loose as she leaned forward, scanning the candy rack for no real reason. The fluorescent lights above reflected in the glass counter, casting fractured patterns across her freckled cheeks. She had worked here for nearly 2 years, mostly quiet shifts filled with truckers, teenagers, and lonely insomniacs buying snacks at odd hours. Nothing in her 24 years had prepared her for this, for the thin line between normalcy and danger vibrating across the store. Ethan approached with measured calm, his boots steady against the tile. His broad shoulders seemed to fill the aisle, but his movements were relaxed, purposeful. He set a pack of jerky and a bottle of water on the counter, a mask of routine. His dark eyes, however, locked briefly with Maya's, communicating more than his words could. Then he lifted one hand and tapped 3 times against the glass surface of the counter. Pause. 3 more. The sound was soft, deliberate. Maya's heart thudded. She recognized the rhythm instantly. She had heard it once in a movie, the universal distress call. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the items, scanning them with unnecessary care. She lifted her chin subtly, caught the hard line of Ethan's jaw, the control in his expression. He wasn't just another late-night customer. He was a soldier or something close, and he was signaling that what she felt in her gut was real. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice pitched just above casual. Ethan's reply came low, almost beneath his breath. "Not even close." He passed her a folded bill, the corner damp from his palm. "Call." The single word froze her. She slid the bill into the register, closed the drawer with a soft click, then reached beneath the counter for the store phone. Her fingers brushed the cold plastic receiver, but Harrington's voice cut across the room. "Is there a problem?" The question was sharp, direct, pulling her eyes. Harrington was still standing beside Sarah, the folder tucked neatly under his arm, his other hand resting lightly on her shoulder like a claim of ownership. His pale blue eyes gleamed under the neon glow, too sharp, too aware. He had seen the exchange. Maya forced a small laugh, holding up the phone as if to show her harmless intent. "Just checking with corporate. They get jumpy when the system hiccups." Her tone carried the practiced annoyance of a retail worker. Her freckles shifted as she stretched her mouth into a half-smile, the kind she gave rude customers. Harrington studied her for a long moment. His expression did not soften, but he turned his gaze back to Sarah, muttering something too low for anyone else to hear. Sarah's face pinched tighter, her lips trembling as she shook her head. Ethan leaned on the counter, his posture still, casual. Maya lifted the receiver, turning her body slightly to shield her movements. Her thumb dialed quickly, pressing 3 digits with deliberate slowness as if she were on hold. The line clicked, and a voice answered, crisp, professional, female. "Sheriff's Department dispatch." Maya whispered into the mouthpiece, her words hidden beneath the scrape of candy she pretended to restock. "This is Maya, convenience store on Route 9. Possible kidnapping. Girl, early 20s, not safe. Man in gray suit. SUV outside. Send units fast." Her hand shook, but she steadied it against the counter. "Units are on the way," the dispatcher replied firmly. "Stay calm. Don't escalate." Maya hung up, placing the phone back into its cradle with a faint clatter. Her chest tightened. She looked up at Ethan, giving the smallest nod. The message was sent. Shadow, positioned close to Ethan's leg, shifted again, his amber eyes glowing under the artificial light. His low growl pulsed like a drumbeat. Ethan crouched briefly, pretending to adjust the leash, and whispered, "Steady." The dog obeyed, though tension rippled through his muscles like electricity. From the back of the store, Kenny shuffled forward, clutching his half-eaten burrito. His tall frame looked awkward in the cramped aisle. Still, his beanie slipping over one eye. "Hey, bathroom locked again?" he asked, his voice uncertain, trying to mask his unease. Maya shook her head quickly. "Key's on the hook." She flicked her eyes toward the wall, silently urging him to get out of the way. Kenny hesitated, reading the tension in her face. His tired green eyes flicked from Ethan to Harrington, then to Sarah, who sat frozen. He swallowed and nodded, disappearing toward the back with heavier steps. Ethan straightened, his voice even, casual, but meant for Maya alone. "Coffee's strong tonight." She caught the hidden weight behind the words. Strong. Reinforcement. Backup. Help coming. She swallowed her fear, forcing another customer service smile. "Best pot we've made in weeks." Harrington's hand tightened on Sarah's arm. She winced, her thin shoulders hunching further. Her long hair veiled her face, but Ethan saw the tear sliding down her cheek. His fists curled against the counter, but he forced himself still. Timing mattered more than impulse. Outside, the SUV's headlights blinked once, on, off, like a signal passed through the glass. Ethan's stomach hardened. The driver was growing restless. If Harrington moved now, there would be no time left. The door chimed again, and a man entered briskly, shaking off the cold. He was in his late 40s, wearing a navy blue uniform jacket with reflective strips. His badge caught the neon glow. Frank Dalton, delivery driver. Frank was tall, broad through the chest, with a neatly trimmed beard peppered with gray. His hair was dark, combed back under a cap with the logo of a regional delivery company. His expression carried the weariness of long hours on the road, but also a sturdy kindness. He gave Maya a nod of recognition. He often stopped by on his routes for coffee and fuel. "Evening," Frank greeted, his voice steady, friendly. He glanced around the store, his eyes briefly scanning Harrington's rigid stance and Sarah's pale, hunched form. His brow furrowed slightly, as if something didn't sit right, but he carried on, walking to the cooler for a drink. Harrington stiffened, his jaw tightening as each new presence complicated his control. He glanced at the door, then back at Sarah, his grip unrelenting. His voice came low and sharp. "Now." Ethan set his coffee down, stepping forward one deliberate pace. Shadow mirrored him, muscles coiled. Maya's breath hitched, her hand gripping the edge of the counter. The thin thread of calm holding the room together was close to snapping. The folder slipped from Harrington's grip as his long fingers clamped around Sarah's thin wrist and pulled her to her feet. papers scattered across the tile, white sheets fluttering like startled birds beneath the harsh neon lights. Sarah let out a sharp cry, her knees buckling as she stumbled against him. Her pale face flushed red at the sudden force, strands of dark hair sticking across her damp cheeks. Her wide hazel eyes darted toward Ethan, silently pleading. Ethan's body moved before thought could interfere. He stepped forward, broad shoulders cutting into Harrington's path, his tall frame blocking the aisle that led toward the door. The air seemed to tighten, the humming refrigerators drowned by the pounding in Ethan's chest. Shadow lunged half a step ahead, teeth bared, a guttural growl filling the store. His sable coat bristled from neck to tail, amber eyes fixed on Harrington's every twitch. Harrington's jaw clenched, his pale blue eyes narrowing. "Step aside," he hissed, his voice low but sharp as a knife's edge. He stood straighter, his angular frame towering over Sarah, who shrank against his arm like a trapped bird. His expensive gray suit stretched at the seams where his muscles tensed. Though lean, he was wiry and strong, a man accustomed to getting what he wanted without resistance. Sarah's body shook violently now. She tugged weakly against Harrington's grip, her nails scraping against his sleeve. Her thin frame looked breakable under his control, yet there was a thread of stubbornness in the way her jaw trembled but did not fully collapse. Her chest rose and fell quickly, breath catching as tears welled. Maya froze behind the counter, both hands gripping the register so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her freckles stood stark against skin drained of color. She glanced toward the phone she had already used, praying backup was closer than her pounding heart suggested. Her voice caught in her throat, too small to break the moment. Frank Dalton, the delivery driver, had just lifted a bottle of soda from the cooler. He turned sharply, his rugged face stiffening as the tension struck him like a blow. At 6 feet tall and broad-chested, Frank had always relied on his presence to disarm trouble on his routes. But this was different. He saw the dog's fury, the soldier's stance, and the predator's icy grip. He placed the bottle quietly on a nearby shelf, his jaw tightening. Frank's life on the road had given him a calm patience, but also a firm sense of justice. He was not the kind of man who could watch silently. His gray-flecked beard bristled as he muttered low, almost to himself, "Not right." Kenny emerged cautiously from the back, burrito forgotten in his hand. His lanky frame looked clumsy in the narrow aisle, but his tired green eyes were suddenly sharp, recognizing the storm about to break. He hesitated, unsure whether to run or help, torn between instinct for self-preservation and the flicker of conscience stirring inside. Ethan's voice cut through the rising tension, deep and unshakable. "She's not going anywhere with you." The words echoed against the shelves, carrying the calm weight of someone who had spoken command in far more dangerous places. Shadow snarled louder, chest heaving, claws clicking against the tile as he leaned forward. Ethan's hand steadied on the leash, not pulling him back, but grounding him, a silent pact between soldier and dog. Harrington's icy smile curved, brittle and dangerous. "You don't know what you're interfering with." His voice dripped with practiced menace. He yanked Sarah closer, her frail body jolting under the force. The scattered papers across the floor shifted in the breeze of the heating vent, some landing near Ethan's boots. Bold black text on one page caught Ethan's eye. Deeds, signatures, property transfers. It wasn't just coercion. It was fraud. A whole network of it. Ethan met Harrington's stare without flinching. "I don't need to know. I can see enough." The silence cracked when Sarah sobbed, her voice breaking. "Please, help me." The sound pierced the room, trembling but clear, her courage surfacing through fear. Maya gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Frank shifted his weight forward, his broad frame angling slightly as if preparing to step in. Kenny dropped the burrito, his lanky arms awkward but clenched into fists. Outside, the SUV's engine revved, headlights flooding the glass front of the store with blinding beams. The driver's silhouette loomed, restless. Harrington's grip tightened, his body coiling. He began to step forward, dragging Sarah toward the exit. Ethan moved instantly, planting himself fully in the path, his chest squared, voice commanding, "You're done." For the first time, Harrington's facade cracked. His pale eyes blazed with frustration, his jaw twitching as the realization set in. He was cornered. He pushed Sarah forward suddenly, trying to use her as a shield, but Shadow exploded with a bark that shook the shelves. The German shepherd lunged, teeth snapping close to Harrington's arm, the leash straining against Ethan's grip. The predator in Shadow was unleashed, his loyalty forged into a wall no man could pass. The store was chaos now. Maya's scream cut through the air. Frank stepped forward, hands raised like a man ready to tackle, and Kenny stumbled back against the shelves, cereal boxes crashing around him. Sarah fell to her knees, Harrington's hold slipping. Ethan's stance remained unbroken, his presence an unmovable force between danger and escape. He felt the weight of every eye in the room, the fear, the desperation. But more than that, he felt the weight of his own vow, never again to stand aside when someone weaker cried for help. The distant wail of sirens pierced the night, faint but rising. Harrington's eyes flickered toward the sound, then back to Ethan, the battle line clear. And in that suspended breath of time, Ethan knew the breaking point had arrived, and the fight was no longer avoidable. The growl of the SUV outside rose like thunder, its headlights pouring through the glass and bleaching the shelves in stark white. The rear door cracked open, a dark invitation waiting for Sarah to be forced through. Harrington's pale eyes flickered between Ethan and the door, calculation whirring like gears behind his icy mask. His grip on Sarah tightened until her thin wrist blanched, her hazel eyes wide with pain and panic. Ethan squared his stance, his chest broad and immovable, voice carrying the iron calm of command. "It's over." "Let her go." Shadow bristled, snarling, body quivering with controlled violence. The German shepherd's ears pressed forward, his teeth bared, each bark suppressed into a deep rumble, a living wall between Sarah and the abyss beyond the door. For a suspended heartbeat, no one moved. Maya's breath hitched audibly behind the counter, her freckles drained pale. Frank Dalton stepped further into the aisle, his broad hands loose at his sides, ready to act. Kenny stumbled backward into the cereal display, heart hammering, his lanky frame frozen between fear and conscience. And then the sirens broke the silence. The rising wail of law enforcement vehicles swept over the parking lot, cutting through the night. Blue and red lights strobed against the glass, shattering the neon's monotony. Harrington's jaw locked, fury flashing through his controlled veneer. He knew his window was gone. The front door slammed open, a blast of freezing wind rushing in with two figures. The first was Sheriff Rachel Monroe, a woman in her early 50s with the presence of someone who had led men twice her size through storms of chaos. She stood tall, just under 6 feet, her uniform a crisp navy blue jacket with polished brass buttons that glinted beneath the flashing lights. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled into a practical bun, her lined face carrying both authority and empathy. Her hazel brown eyes were sharp, scanning the scene in an instant. Soldier, captive, predator, dog, assembling the truth without hesitation. Her hand rested firmly on the grip of her sidearm, but she did not draw yet. Monroe was known in the county for her ability to de-escalate with presence alone. Life had hardened her, but loss, whispers of a son killed years ago in a highway accident, had etched compassion into the edges of her command. Behind her was Deputy Tommy Alvarez, younger by decades, still in the first flush of his career. 28, lean and wiry, with short sandy hair and eyes the bright green of spring fields. His uniform was slightly less polished, his badge newer, but his earnestness radiated. He moved quickly, his boots confident against the tile, handcuffs ready in one palm. Tommy had once been a high school basketball player, his reflexes quick, but it was his relentless conviction in the badge that defined him now. He was eager, sometimes too eager, but Monroe tempered him like steel under a hammer. "Hands where I can. See them!" Monroe's voice cracked across the store, firm, unwavering. Harrington's smile was thin and venomous. He tightened his grip on Sarah, dragging her closer to his chest like a shield. "This isn't what you think," he hissed, eyes flicking from Ethan to the officers. "She's mine to handle," Sarah whimpered, shaking her head desperately. "No, please." Her voice cracked, breaking the illusion in a single sound. Tommy moved, swift as a coiled spring. "Let her go." His cuffs glinted in the blue-red wash. Harrington shoved Sarah forward, trying to pivot toward the SUV, but Shadow was faster. The Shepherd launched forward with explosive power, his bark erupting like cannon fire. Harrington jerked back instinctively, his rhythm shattered. Shadow landed in front of him, teeth bared inches from his arm, eyes blazing with feral loyalty. The predator had met his match in an animal bred for courage. In that instant, Ethan lunged, his broad hand locking onto Harrington's wrist, twisting it away from Sarah. The folder fell again, scattering more papers across the floor. Harrington snarled, his wiry strength flaring, but Ethan's grip was iron, forged from years of combat and discipline. Tommy closed the distance. The metallic clink of cuffs echoed as he seized Harrington's other arm, snapping one wrist into the steel. Harrington thrashed, his face contorted with rage, but Monroe's presence anchored the room. She stepped closer, her voice sharp as steel. "Cole Harrington, you're under arrest. You're done." The final cuff clicked shut with a sound that ended the struggle. Tack! The cold snap of finality. Sarah collapsed to her knees, sobbing, clutching her freed wrist. Her long hair fell forward, shielding her flushed face, tears dripping onto the tiles. Ethan crouched beside her, his hand hovering respectfully near her shoulder. Shadow pressed against her side, his warmth steadying, his panting breath carrying the weight of a guardian. Maya's chest heaved as she released the counter, her legs weak with relief. Frank let out a long breath, the tension draining from his broad frame. Kenny sagged against the shelves, cereal crunching beneath his boots, his stunned eyes wide but alive. Outside, the SUV screeched into gear, tires squealing. Another deputy was already in pursuit, the chase roaring into the night. But inside the convenience store, the storm had broken. Sheriff Monroe holstered her sidearm, her lined face softening slightly as she looked at Sarah. "You're safe now." Her words carried the authority of law, but also the gentleness of a mother who had known loss. Sarah's sobs eased into hiccups, her small frame trembling as she nodded. Ethan helped her into a chair, Shadow never leaving her side. For the first time, she dared to meet Ethan's eyes directly. Gratitude shone through the haze of fear, and Ethan, though silent, understood. This night had changed everything, for her and perhaps for him too. Sarah collapsed against the floor, her thin frame trembling as sobs poured from her chest. Her long black hair veiled her face as she pressed herself into Shadow's sable fur. The German Shepherd stood firm, tail low but wagging slightly, sensing the change from danger to release. His amber eyes softened, his sharp growl fading into steady panting. Sarah's tears soaked into his thick coat, her arms wrapping tightly around him as though he were the anchor that kept her from drifting into the abyss. Ethan knelt beside her, his large hand steady as it came to rest lightly on her shoulder. His calloused fingers, rough from years of service, were careful not to press too hard. "You're safe now," he said, his deep voice softer than before, like the rumble of a distant storm retreating. Sarah lifted her face slowly, eyes red-rimmed and wet, lips trembling. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe those words. The store around them exhaled. Maya let out a shaky laugh, covering her face with one hand. Her auburn ponytail slipped free as she leaned heavily on the counter, relief replacing the tension etched into her freckled skin. Frank Dalton, broad-chested and weary, picked up the bottle of soda he had abandoned earlier and shook his head with disbelief. "Damn," he muttered, his gravelly voice cutting the silence. "Thought I'd seen long nights on the road, but nothing like this." He glanced at Ethan, respect in his gray-flecked eyes. Kenny stood awkwardly amid the spilled cereal boxes, lanky frame bent as he tried to straighten the mess he had caused in panic. His green eyes darted toward Sarah, then quickly away, ashamed at how frozen he had been. Yet in his trembling hands there was the spark of someone who knew he could have been braver, and perhaps would be if given another chance. Outside, Harrington was shoved into the back of a cruiser, his angular face pressed into the seat as steel cuffs gleamed around his wrists. His pale eyes, once full of icy control, now burned with impotent rage. Another deputy, stocky and balding, secured the vehicle. His name patch read Deputy Carl Henderson, a veteran of 20 years on the force, his round face lined with fatigue, but anchored by quiet diligence. Henderson was not a man of flair. He was steady, dependable, the kind who showed up every shift and carried the weight of the small town without complaint. He closed the cruiser door with finality, the slam echoing across the lot. Sheriff Rachel Monroe stepped back inside, the cold air clinging to her Navy uniform. Her silver-streaked bun was slightly loosened from the rush, but her hazel-brown eyes still carried steel. She surveyed the shaken group with a softened gaze. A commander now turned caretaker. "Paramedics are on their way," she announced. Her voice held calm authority, but underneath it was a motherly cadence, one that steadied rather than startled. Sarah's lips quivered. "Thank you," she whispered, though her eyes stayed on Ethan and Shadow. Monroe crouched slightly, her uniform creaking. She touched Sarah's free hand, her grip firm but kind. "You did the bravest thing possible. You asked for help." "That saved you." Ethan rose slowly, his back straight though weariness pressed against him. He met Monroe's gaze, and for a long moment, two veterans of different battles measured one another. She read in him the discipline of a soldier, the quiet vigilance of someone who could not ignore suffering. He read in her the steadiness of a leader who had borne personal loss, yet chosen to stand for others. Monroe nodded once, acknowledging silently what he had done. Deputy Tommy Alvarez entered behind her, his green eyes wide, adrenaline still sparking through his lean frame. He holstered his cuffs with a clumsy flourish, still too new to hide his nerves. "He fought hard," Tommy muttered, glancing toward the cruiser outside. "Didn't expect him to crack so fast once the dog moved." His voice carried equal parts awe and relief. Shadow flicked an ear at the mention, settling calmly at Ethan's side as though the chaos had been only another drill. The glass door opened again, and two paramedics entered with brisk efficiency. One was Angela Ruiz, mid-30s, short with dark curly hair pulled back, her brown eyes sharp with competence. She had the air of someone who had seen panic before and knew how to cut through it. The other was Mark Jensen, taller, sandy-haired, broad-shouldered, his cheeks ruddy from the cold. He moved with the steadiness of a man used to carrying weight, his deep voice gentle as he spoke. "Miss, let's get you checked out." Sarah hesitated, but allowed them to guide her to a chair. Angela knelt, checking her wrist where Harrington had squeezed so hard. "Sprained, maybe bruised. You'll be okay." Sarah nodded faintly, whispering her thanks. Mark handed her a blanket from his bag, draping it gently over her thin shoulders. Ethan stood nearby, arms crossed loosely. He felt the quiet in his chest now, the aftermath of battle, when the adrenaline drained but the weight of responsibility lingered. He had meant only to stop for coffee. Instead, he had stepped back into the role he thought he had left behind. Monroe walked toward him, her boots firm against the tile. "Cole, is it?" she asked, her tone even. "Ethan Cole," he replied, his voice steady. "You acted decisively, and you kept a girl alive tonight." Monroe studied him, her sharp eyes softening slightly. "This town could use men like you. Not in uniform, not tied down, but as someone who can stand where others might hesitate." She paused. "Ever think about consulting? Security advising?" Ethan looked down at Shadow, whose ears perked, as if waiting for his answer. The dog's amber eyes reflected trust, loyalty, and something Ethan often struggled to find in himself: certainty. He let the silence stretch, then nodded slowly. "If it means fewer people slip through the cracks," he said, "I'll help." Monroe's lined face eased into something like a smile. "Then we'll talk." The store slowly returned to stillness. Maya wiped down the counter with trembling hands, forcing herself back into the rhythm of her job. Frank finally picked up his soda, muttering about needing stronger coffee. Kenny stacked the last of the fallen boxes, his green eyes meeting Sarah's briefly before he looked away in shy relief. Sarah, wrapped in the blanket, whispered once more to Ethan, her voice fragile but clear, "I thought no one would see me." Ethan crouched slightly, meeting her gaze. "I saw you." And so did he. He gestured toward Shadow, who pressed his head gently against her leg. She smiled faintly through tears, stroking the dog's fur. Outside, dawn was beginning to break, the faintest pale light battling the neon glow that still lit the store. The flashing police lights painted the lot in shards of red and blue. But beyond them, the first honest daylight was coming. A small sound, a tap, 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 echoed faintly as Sarah's fingers brushed the counter in absent habit. Ethan's heart tightened at the rhythm. It was not desperate now. It was memory, gratitude, survival. And in the hum of neon, the warmth of a dog's breath, and the first light of morning, a quiet truth remained. A small signal, seen and answered, had saved a life.